The further you dig into the First World War, the more you realize the battlefield wasn't the only place where ingenuity determined survival. Behind the front lines, especially in the rural stretches of Europe where armies had to feed themselves and civilians struggled through shortages, people had to keep crops alive with systems that didn't rely on modern machinery, engines, or reliable power. And that's where these little-known irrigation innovations come into focus. They weren't glamorous, they weren't complex, but they worked. More importantly, they hold practical lessons for anyone studying wartime logistics, agricultural history, or off-grid survival. So before we dive into the 7 techniques, understand this. What kept fields alive during the First World War wasn't technology. It was ingenuity, physics, and stubborn necessity. If you enjoy understanding forgotten systems that actually performed under pressure, then you'll want to stick with this because these methods still work today and can be replicated with basic tools. How simple gravity-fed trench lines saved entire wartime farms. The cornerstone of WW1 irrigation was gravity. Many farms lost their draft animals, pumps and manpower to the front, yet fields still had to be watered. Farmers carved shallow trench lines from a higher water source down into their plots. The trick was to cut the channels with just enough slope to let water flow steadily without eroding the soil. In France's agricultural belts, families sometimes dug these channels at night because they had no labour left during the day. This was a quiet war effort of its own. To apply this today, you could run a narrow channel from a rain-fed holding pond or elevated cistern straight into garden rows. The technique requires patience more than equipment. Set your source just a metre higher, scratch out a continuous grade, and let gravity earn its keep, exactly as it did a century ago. Why WW1 farmers revived the centuries-old field-soaking method. When you didn't have pipes or hoses, you had to rely on infiltration rather than targeted watering. Many European farms returned to the field-soaking technique, where water from a stream or canal was diverted into a controlled flood at the top of a field. The soil drank slowly, distributing moisture evenly before the excess bled off into a run-off trench. Soldiers stationed in rural billets often wrote home about helping locals repair the tiny earthen berms used to control the flow. If you want to apply this today, especially in areas where rainfall is inconsistent, you can create a raised lip around your crop patch, release water at one end, and let saturation do the work. It's surprisingly effective for grains, potatoes and root crops, just as it was during the war years. How clay pot seep irrigation kept gardens alive during shortages. When supply lines collapsed, people had to grow kitchen gardens to survive. But without pumps or pipes, small plots risked drying out. That's when buried clay jars came into play. Filled with water and sealed, except for a porous surface, they slowly released moisture into the surrounding soil. This method is ancient, but WW1 revived it heavily in Central and Eastern Europe. It's still one of the best off-grid systems you can use today. Bury unglazed clay pots near your plants, fill them, and let the natural seepage provide slow, consistent hydration. In survival terms, the advantage is efficiency. Water loss is almost zero. Now, let's talk about how soldiers and farmers built hillside contour channels with nothing but hand tools. Contour irrigation, you see, became absolutely crucial in places where the terrain worked against farmers. Instead of, fighting against the slopes, people learned to use them to their advantage. Workers would carve these narrow contour channels, carefully following the natural curves of a hill. The water would then move sideways, not just straight downhill, and that helped prevent runoff and erosion. This style, by the way, showed up in wartime Italy, the Balkans, and even parts of France. Really, anywhere armies had taken over farmland, and locals needed to get the most out of the land with as little effort as possible. If you wanted to replicate this today, you'd walk the slope, mark out lines of equal height, and carve shallow horizontal paths. The water will linger just long enough for the ground to soak it up, and that, right there, is the very principle that kept hillside farms producing food during the shortages of 1914 to 1918. When manpower was scarce, bucket relays actually kept watering possible on countless farms. Simple, grueling and effective, bucket relays were, the backbone of many wartime farms when all other systems broke down. Now, while it might sound a bit primitive, what really makes this a hack is the systemization behind it. Households created timed cycles. Someone filled containers at the source, someone else handed them off, and another poured them at the crop rows. Even wounded veterans recovering at home often pitched in, keeping the whole system alive. If you reduce it to its logic rather than its labour, you'll see the method still applies today. When you're off-grid, you design a workflow instead of relying on pressure or pumps. You establish points where water is collected, staged and distributed, so you avoid all that constant back and forth. It's human logistics in its rawest form. Improvised stone-lined channels were a clever way to prevent water loss in dry regions. In places like parts of the Austro-Hungarian countryside, the real problem wasn't soil absorption, it was leakage. So the solution was to line irrigation channels with stones or broken tiles. This prevented seepage, kept water moving over longer distances, and, importantly, reduced the collapse of the ditch walls. During the First World War, many families scavenged rubble from damaged buildings just to reinforce these channels. You can do the same thing today. Line a trench with rock or brick fragments, and you'll guide the flow over long stretches. It's a simple way to move water across a homestead without pumps, hoses, or the risk of losing half of it to the earth before it ever reaches your crops. The last technique is, arguably, the most important. With weather patterns disrupted and supply so unpredictable, farmers started digging storage pits to trap rainfall and slowly release it through overflow channels. These pits often sat uphill from the fields, acting as passive reservoirs. Soldiers stationed in rear areas even helped expand them, knowing full well that local harvests kept everyone supplied. If you want to recreate one today, it's really straightforward. Dig a basin, reinforce the edges with packed earth, and direct gutter runoff or natural drainage into it. From there, gravity-fed channels do the rest. It's a fully passive irrigation system. No electricity, no pump, and no maintenance beyond the occasional bit of clearing. If this deep dive into 7 genius First World War irrigation hacks that worked without electricity or pumps gave you new insight into the forgotten agricultural realities of the Great War, make sure you subscribe to Warpaths of Europe and share this with fellow enthusiasts. The more we explore these overlooked aspects of history, the richer our understanding becomes.